Welcome to Host Directed, a two-part miniseries that will explore the need for antivirals to treat severe respiratory disease. Brought to you by Synergen, the respiratory company developing SNG-001, an investigational formulation for inhalation containing the broad-spectrum antiviral protein interferon beta to treat or prevent severe viral lung infections. For more information about Synergen, visit synergen.com. I'm Dr. David Canty, your host for Host Directed. Broad-spectrum antibiotics have saved millions of lives, in part because they can stop a bacterial infection before anyone understands the microbe causing it. But no such broad-spectrum medicines exist to stop viral infections. If the 1950s and 60s were the golden age of antibiotics, is this now the age of antivirals? Joining us to discuss antivirals in today's episode, Not All Antivirals Are the Same, are Tom Wilkinson, Professor of Respiratory Medicine at the University of Southampton and NIHR Southampton Biomedical Research. And also joining us will be Vicki Tier, Vice President of Non-Clinical Operations at Synergen. Well, Professor Wilkinson, let's begin with you. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining us today. Could you please give us a little more information about your background and research on antivirals?
Sure. So, thanks for having me. I'm a pulmonologist, as you'd say in the States, a respiratory physician in the UK, and I have a clinical practice which it really focuses on caring for patients with lung disease who are particularly susceptible to infection. I'm a professor of respiratory medicine and I hold a chair at the University of Southampton in the UK, where I lead a program of research really trying to develop new treatments for respiratory infections and for patients with chronic lung disease, conditions such as asthma and COPD.
Could we start out with, maybe you could just, at a very basic level, describe what is the difference between bacteria and viruses?
So that's a very deep question. We could talk about that for the next 2 hours. So bacteria are really autonomous organisms. They're small unicellular organisms which can live independently. When they evade the immune system, they can cause disease. Similarly, viruses can cause disease, but they do it via very different processes. They contain a lot of the machinery for developing life, but independently, they can't actually reproduce or generate new viruses. So they rely on host cells. So whilst they both cause infections, they do it in very different ways and therefore need different ways to prevent and treat them.
So viruses have this whole different mechanism, as you say, compared to bacteria. How do the antiviral agents work on the viruses? And are antiviral agents all the same, or are there differences?
So viruses can affect cells by binding and entering cells. They then can shed their coding material and actually take over the machinery of the cell and really program the cell to take on the responsibility of producing new viruses instead of its own proteins. There are different ways of stopping viruses replicating in a cell, producing RNA or DNA, or coming together and producing the right proteins in the right shape to actually produce a new virus. And so antivirals are really drugs which can interfere with each of those processes.
With more than about, 90 antivirals available for various diseases, what would be the benefit of a broad spectrum antiviral, would you say?
Each virus has a very specific life cycle, a specific type of cell and host that it tries to infect. We know that there are lots of different respiratory viruses, and it's really not until we understand that each of those viruses very often would require a bespoke antiviral if it was to target that pathogen, that virus alone. If I'm seeing a patient who is unwell with a particular virus, I would have to select a conventional antiviral specific to that one type of virus. And that adds complexity and cost. And in developing a whole range of different antivirals. So having a drug which you could apply, knowing a patient had a viral infection that was pretty sure that it was going to work effectively independent of which virus was causing the illness, would be a real boon. It would be usable in different clinical settings. It wouldn't require a rapid test, and it could potentially impact on many different types of illness caused by respiratory or indeed other viruses, depending on its indication.
Can you talk a little bit more about the host or the host targeted or the host directed antivirals?
So if we're looking at virus targeted antivirals, we're thinking about very specific targets within the virus, and that's where we need that broad spectrum of activity. The amazing thing about biology and the evolutionary relationship is that we've evolved very effective antiviral mechanisms which can actually either prevent or reduce the impact of viral infections. So our bodies produce proteins as part of what we call the innate immune system very early on in the cycle of infection, which can actually switch off virus machinery and stop that virus taking over the cell. If we could have treatments that could augment or strengthen that innate immune response, it could potentially work against a whole array of viruses. It's a really exciting prospect and could offer us a new approach to treating viruses, which may not be so susceptible to the development of resistance that conventional targeted treatments to the virus itself are.
I see. And that would open up a lot of opportunities for antiviral therapies in treating patients hospitalized with a whole range of different viruses that you enumerated. Are there any such host-targeted antivirals currently in development?
So interferon beta is one of these naturally occurring proteins. It's produced by most cells in response to viral infection, and it switches off this viral machinery that we were talking about earlier. So by giving interferon as a drug to the right place in the lung or in a different area, depending on the site of infection, we can really start to augment that response, strengthen that innate immune response, and switch off viral replication whilst the body is trying to heal and repair. And I think that's, for us, a very exciting proposition.
And the benefit then of, for example, an inhaled broad spectrum host-directed antiviral comes from the fact that, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're localizing it to the lungs, which is where the problem is, of course, with a respiratory infection. Is that the sole benefit, or is there another benefit, I don't know, from either tolerability or any other aspect of a treatment that would do that?
Yeah, so I think if we're targeting a drug to the lung, we know that respiratory viruses enter the body through the respiratory epithelium, and getting a drug into that cell, which is there in a high concentration, which can therefore help the body fight the virus, is a really important goal. An inhaled version of the drug, therefore, offers that opportunity. The other benefit is that these drugs, therefore, are not in high concentrations in the rest of the body. And so we don't have the usual side effects in other organ systems that you might do using a different route of administration. This allows us to give the drugs to patients that may be in quite a vulnerable state. They may have severe viral infection. They may have other organ involvement or comorbidities from other conditions. And therefore, hopefully, it will give us a cleaner safety profile for this treatment. The real burden of these common infections is enormous. And sadly, some patients will succumb to common respiratory viral infections even today with the best care available. And therefore, work to develop new antivirals is really important. It will be life-saving. And so as a research group and as a community, this is real focus for us to try and develop a better standard of care.
Well, that's a great note to end upon, I think. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to share your experience and your insights with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, David. It's been a pleasure.
Our next guest to take this discussion a bit further is Vicki Tier, Vice President of Non-Clinical Operations at Synergen. Welcome to the podcast, Vicki, and thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you're doing at Synergen?
Yes, certainly. So I've been at Synergen since 2007 and watched the company grow, and started working in the labs with samples from patients with COPD and asthma and healthy subjects learning what our drug could do in cell-based experiments using those well-characterized samples. Mm-hmm. And then moved on through the company and been involved in lots of external collaborations and lots of clinical trials along the way with asthma patients and COPD patients.
Tell me, what does host targeted actually mean, and why is that an important thing to be talking about these days?
So host-targeted antiviral is an antiviral that acts on the body rather than the virus itself. So during a respiratory virus infection, the body's immune response is the front line of defense. And central to this immune response is the release of a protein which is naturally occurring called interferon beta. And this is vital for orchestrating the body's antiviral responses.
What about the term broad spectrum? And, I think some people might know what that means in the context of antibiotics, but what does it mean in the context of antivirals?
So a broad spectrum antiviral would be an antiviral that works against a range of different viruses. And interferon beta has been shown we've done lots of cell-based assays to show that interferon beta is effective against lots of different viruses. So we've shown in cell-based assays that it's effective against this wide range of viruses. And then we've been looking in clinical trials at patients with different respiratory viruses and their responses.
Can you tell us a bit about SNG-001 in this context of broad spectrum?
Absolutely. So as I said, interferon beta boosts the body's antiviral immune responses rather than targeting the virus itself, which means it can be used to potentially treat any virus infection. And it's a formulation of interferon beta which has been designed to be inhaled to the lungs, which are the main site of the virus infection. And although we've made huge strides forward in terms of the development of antivirals in the last few years and before that, there's still a big unmet need for broad spectrum antiviral treatments to treat a range of viruses.
That's really interesting, Vicki. Why is host-targeted or host-directed so important when it comes to addressing severe viral respiratory infections?
Well, since viruses naturally mutate, they're able to evade virus-directed therapies and develop what's called antiviral resistance. And one example of this would be some of the monoclonal antibodies that we used earlier in the pandemic for SARS coronavirus 2 that were effective earlier on in the pandemic, and then towards the end either became completely ineffective or less effective, whereas host-directed antivirals would not be susceptible to this problem and would still be able to boost the antiviral responses rather than targeting the virus itself, and therefore they don't have these issues. And they're also effective across a range of respiratory viruses rather than just one virus, which is common for the virus-directed therapies. And a host-directed therapy could be used to treat patients with any of these respiratory viruses and help prevent progression to severe disease. And a host-directed therapy could also be used in a pandemic setting in the future when needed.
Vicki, what excites you most of all about the potential of a host-directed antiviral?
I just think it's exciting that one molecule or one molecule could target all these different viruses, and everything else is, all these virus-directed therapies are targeting one virus or a family of viruses. And this has the potential to target any respiratory viruses out there at the moment, or anything that may come along in the future, which I think is a very exciting concept.
Well, Vicki, this has been very informative. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences and your insights with us today. Once again, we really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, David. It was really nice to meet you.
This concludes our first episode of Host Directed. Thank you for joining us. Next time on Host Directed, we will explore the inhaled formulation of interferon beta and how it works to orchestrate immune response. Thank you for joining us, and breathe easy.